Hello, I'm Anita Casalina. Welcome to Earth 2.0. As many of us know, setting goals and timelines for ourselves personally helps us to focus and achieve more in our own lives. Well, the same is true when we think about how to repair our planet's ecosystems. Having a plan and a timeline gives us the structure to accomplish more. And our guest, Stephen Fern, has a very big plan and timeline to do just that. Stephen is the chairman of ARC 2030, whose mission is to reverse global warming and end the climate crisis by restoring and regenerating 500 million hectares, which is over 1 billion acres of ecosystems by the year 2030. Welcome, Stephen. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here.
So tell me about ARC 2030.
ARC 2030 was born on the day that the United Nations announced that we have just 12 years to save the planet. And I spent much of the last 20 years working on amazing projects around the world with big business families. And I sat and listened to that project and thought, wow, we have 12 years to save the planet. If that had been NASA telling us that an asteroid was going to obliterate planet Earth in 12 years, we would all be thinking very differently. But because the climate crisis isn't a single cataclysmic event, we're behaving in a way, we're all digging shelters in our backyard. And I thought, we need our kind of Bruce Willis moment, the world uniting behind, how do we actually sort of send a rocket up and drill a hole and blow the asteroid apart? We need that solution, but for the climate crisis. And although I wasn't wearing a string vest, I thought, okay, maybe this is my moment, and I've got to step forward and come up with that single unifying plan to end the climate crisis.
That's really excellent. I often think of the climate crisis as this slow, creeping, chronic disease as opposed to something that's acute. That if you get a cold, you notice you're sick, but if you just have an aching leg or something, it's like, oh, my leg's bad today. And I think a lot of people feel incredibly overwhelmed by how enormous that seems. And as I said in my introduction to you, making a plan and setting timelines and goals always helps us to get much more done in our lives personally. And that's what you've done here with ARC 2030. So tell us about what the plan is and the goals that you have in mind.
Yeah, I think the starting point was exactly that sense of hopelessness about the task. We've spent decades listening to scientists telling of doom and despondency. And Paris Accord for me was a fantastic sort of illustration of that. For us to actually set a target that is allowing the planet to increase its temperature by 1.5 degrees. It's almost like coming 7th in the Olympic Games. It's a great achievement, but it's not winning. And what I wanted to know is, what does winning mean when it comes to the climate crisis? And actually, if you just set off on a journey, you need to know what your destination is. And nobody had really done that. Planting 1 million trees or 1 billion trees, what does that mean? It meant nothing. So I needed to know what the target was. And because of, again, 20 years of working in this business with great families and great projects, we were able to tap into some phenomenal people. And to kind of very long story short, the target is we need to restore planet Earth back to where it was environmentally before we destroyed it. So that's before the Industrial Revolution. And humankind has destroyed 500 million hectares of ecosystems around the world in the last 2 centuries. So my starting point was to say, okay, what does it take for us to restore 500 million hectares of planet?
Wow. So when you talk about the time frame when this first began, what year approximately are we looking at? The beginning of the Industrial Revolution was, what would you say?
Yeah, early 1800s.
Early 1800s. So you've got 200 years. Yeah, you've got 200 years to rewind.
And the vast majority of that has really been damage caused since the early 1970s. Right. So there's been a sort of an exponential curve. But really the idea was to say, mankind really started destroying ecosystems on an industrial scale at the beginning of the 1800s. And we've destroyed 340 million hectares in that time. And we continue to destroy another 20 million hectares a year. And these numbers are incomprehensible. To put that into context, most people can't sort of visualize a million hectares. But when a Swiss philanthropist 2 years ago decided to fund and protect a 1 million hectare piece of Brazilian rainforest, that was front page global news. And what we're talking about is 500 million hectares. And so to kind of comprehend that is a huge, huge challenge. And that was really the first thing that we had to do. How do you make that so that it's not so overwhelming? When people are faced with a huge challenge, it's normally freeze and decide not to do anything.
Exactly.
And I just felt we just had to step up and say, how do we actually do this? And so I go back to sort of, communication, making these messages simple. In essence, I thought, imagine this as a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle of the planet. And the key sort of message here is that if each jigsaw puzzle piece is a 1 million hectare project, then effectively you can visualize this huge project in a way that's quite intelligible. We've got a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle of the planet. When we complete it, we've restored planet Earth back to where it was. And if you want to know what each piece of the jigsaw puzzle means, you can take it out and you can say, this has got to be more than a vision. It's got to be a reality. There's the 1 million hectares. I'm going to tell you what we're going to do, where we're going to do it, who's going to do it, and how we're going to do it. And by mapping it out, it becomes comprehensible.
So each piece of this puzzle is a project, essentially. Is that what you're saying? So 1 million hectares is one project that you've picked out. Where are these pieces, and how did you choose those particular pieces?
Well, I think what happened then was looking at this 500-piece jigsaw puzzle and kind of thinking, well, there are 5 great ecosystems on this planet. There is rainforests, forests, deserts, oceans, and savannas. So 5 great ecosystems. So actually, the 500 million hectares becomes 100 million hectares of each of those ecosystems. And then each of our major continents has got typically each of those ecosystems within them. So actually what you're looking at is taking somewhere like Australia and saying, you've got to deliver some oceans, some rainforests, some desert rectification, and some forestry, and regenerating farmland. So each continent has got to deliver 2 million hectares of ecosystem restoration a year for each of the projects. That actually sounds quite doable. When you start talking about doing just 2 million hectares of rainforest in Africa, yeah, that's manageable. Do that each year for 10 years, and we complete the jigsaw puzzle.
How do you get the support to be able to obtain those big pieces of land? Who, when you say the continents have to give those, you have to be able to negotiate with, governments and maybe indigenous people. And how are you going about that?
Yeah, I think the reality is that what you're looking at is typically Southern Hemisphere continents. Trying to do this in Northern Europe or North America is actually incredibly complex and very difficult. But if you go into South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia, you have huge tracts of land which are wilderness effectively. And you are able to go and look at, the Amazon rainforest, the Andes, the great green belt across Africa. And what you've got is a situation where if you turn up into any of those countries or any of those continents and say, hey, we're going to plant 1 million trees, and it doesn't mean anything to the local people, you're not going to get very far. So the existing model of NGOs and NGO funding, in essence, delivers something that those populations kind of don't want. What you have to do is go in with some strategic thinking. So if you go into sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and take degraded farmland, you could take 100,000 hectares of degraded farmland that currently support maybe 1,000 families with their goats and their cattle just roaming around 100,000 hectares. If we basically implement the best science, the best technology, the best regenerative agricultural practice in 100,000 hectares, within 5 years, we can be supporting 250,000 people in their own homes, living, working, access to great food, clean water, healthcare, and education. So the solution in environmental restoration isn't about just planting trees and taking plastic out of oceans. It's about understanding the multi-stakeholder interests in every piece of land. And when you go in and you effectively are going to deliver something that the local community benefits from, that they can derive a sustainable income from, that they get educated and they get access to healthcare, of course, they welcome you with open arms. It's very different than effectively ecological colonialism, where you just go in and say, hey, move out of the way, we're going to plant some trees. That model's got to be thrown out, and we have to be much more strategic.
I like that term, ecological colonialism, because that's something that I've looked at quite a bit in my own life, the superimposition of our value system on indigenous people, rather than saying, what do you need? What would help you to have a better life, and what would help you with your families, with your community, with education, with your children? So that's really the negotiation. The negotiation isn't so much from the top down, it's from the grassroots level, isn't it?
Absolutely. So yeah. defining the strategy at the top is essentially putting out these parameters that say, you have to do multi-stakeholder, and you have to get everybody's interests on the table when you start a particular program. And in essence, that is in part why the current NGO model has failed us, because the NGO model is basically survival. A grant is dangled in front of 50 NGOs saying, we want to plant some trees. Nobody really cares whether it's the right trees in the right place and everything else around it. We just want the PR of planting trees. Well, that doesn't work. What you also then have is NGOs who are all desperate for that cash, all competing with each other. No sharing of knowledge, no sharing of expertise. Why? Because their survival depends upon getting that grant and winning. And then when they get that money, they're not necessarily doing it because it's the right thing for the environment. They're doing it because they just need to plant those trees because that's what that grant says they need to do. So you got to break the back of that and actually use their knowledge and expertise of all the stakeholders in an incredibly collaborative way. It's about collaboration and partnerships. And that's everything from the indigenous people on the ground, the local landholders, the local knowledge, but bringing in global expertise and global wisdom and blending the two to create a solution that's right for all the stakeholders on the ground, the biodiversity, the people, the landowners. All of those things have got to be brought into the equation. And literally, that is what has failed this system for the last 50 years.
So everyone who is affected gets a vote, essentially, gets to weigh in. So, Stephen, how's it going so far?
Well, where we are at the moment, I think what is really important to set out is the world is full of people with brilliant ideas and great visions. And I've come across and worked with many of them for the last 20 years. The harsh reality is there is no money. And this kind of idea of how we address the climate crisis is based on nature-based solutions, spending $5 or $6 or $8 billion a year. We need it to be $100 billion a year. And so the key driver for us, and in essence, the stage we're at now, is about to go live globally, which is a reward system, a loyalty point system that actually connects global brands with the work done on the ground and with the consumers. Because the light bulb moment I had was in terms of funding this, was saying, this is not about going to companies and wealthy families and asking for donations. That's incredibly hard, and it will not work at the scale we're after. You've got to give companies a reason to do this, a positive reason that gives them shareholder value. And there's one message that is more important than any other for every company on the planet at the moment, which is to say to its customers and its employees and its stakeholders, we care about the planet. But only 12% of the population believe a company when it says we're going to do something. So we created a loyalty program that connects the projects on the ground with the brand and with the consumer. And by doing that, instead of a donation or a grant getting 30 seconds of publicity for a big global brand and then it disappears, instead of an action that is we're throwing money at something but we don't know where it's going, we've built and constructed the technology so you can walk into your local store and instead of getting points that gives you a few cents off the next time you go in off your toiletries or your vegetables, the points effectively deliver the jigsaw puzzle. We're going to show you how the work is being done. And when you receive those points as a consumer, you can click on your points and it'll take you to the ground, the very space where those points, that money is being spent. So transparency in a way we've never seen before. and it allows the consumer to engage with the customer, with the brand, and we can all start understanding the implications of our behavior. So it's about education and information for the conscious consumption, a new generation for the planet, so that every time we're transacting, we're reminded of the implications of that on the planet, but we're also reminded of the great work that those companies are doing to help restore the planet as part of ARC 2030.
So it's like a sponsorship, basically. Each person who is receiving those points then knows that they are sponsoring maybe a rainforest or some other part of, where are the first areas that you're working in?
Yeah, we have basically already launched the Restore Africa and Restore Australia programs. So the four really big continent-wide programs are South America, where you've got the iconic sort of, the Amazon and the Andes. You've got Africa, where the great green belt of Africa needs to be built. You've also got India, where you're looking at things like the Great Ganges cleanup, because 10 rivers on this planet account for 95% of the pollution that goes into our oceans. So you need to stop it at source. So you go into the Ganges and find out why it's producing such toxic river water into our oceans. Stop that at source, you stop the pollution of the oceans at source. But we're starting in Australia, which is actually the first world economy most impacted by the climate crisis. And we all saw that with the fires over Christmas and New Year. And so Australia's got some iconic ecosystems that we're starting with, protecting the Great Barrier Reef, restoring the 10 million hectares destroyed by the fires, and actually taking the entire Australian wheat belt, which has been degraded by both the climate crisis and modern agricultural techniques, and bringing back resilient farming techniques that will bring that back to life, effectively re-greening Australia.
This is just incredible. It's such a big vision, but what I'm seeing as you talk about it is it's big, but it divides up in such a way that it's manageable. And that's what people need to get their minds around. They need to see manageable pieces, like the jigsaw puzzle, like you're putting together. This is very exciting work. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night over there in the UK, as we have a wonderful afternoon here in the United States. And thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.